The report exists. It is not classified. It has been available to researchers for decades, sitting in the National Archives in a folder that is neither hidden nor highlighted, filed under a reference number that you would need to know to look for. It was written in 1973, 5 years before Jonestown. It describes, in the careful bureaucratic language of federal documentation, a religious organization in California that is confiscating the passports of its members, that is using physical punishment to enforce discipline, that is holding residents against their will, that is stockpiling weapons, and that is led by a man whose behavior has become, in the assessment of the agent who wrote the report, a credible threat to the safety of the people under his authority. The report was filed. It was reviewed. It was assigned a case number. And then, for reasons that have never been fully explained in any official document or congressional inquiry or journalistic investigation, it was set aside. 5 years later, 918 people died in Jonestown, Guyana. The report is still in the archive. The case number is still active. The reasons it was set aside have never been given. If you have ever trusted a system to protect people it did not protect, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because this channel exists to show you not just what Jim Jones did, but what made it possible for him to keep doing it. And the answer, this time, is not psychology. It is paperwork. Go back to 1972. Go back to a woman named Vera Washington sitting in a federal building in San Francisco, across a desk from an agent whose name appears in the documents only as a case number, telling him everything she knows about People's Temple. Vera Washington had been a member of People's Temple for 4 years. She had left 8 months earlier, taking her 2 children with her in the middle of the night, driving to her sister's house in Oakland with nothing except what she could fit in a single bag. She had spent the 8 months since leaving trying to get anyone, to listen to what she had experienced inside the organization. She had gone to local police, who told her that religious organizations were outside their jurisdiction unless a specific crime could be demonstrated. She had gone to a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, who listened and took notes and told her he would look into it and never called her back. She had gone to her state assemblyman's office, where a staff member had been polite and had given her a form to fill out and had not followed up. And now she was sitting across from a federal agent, and she was going to tell him everything, and she was going to ask him to do something about it, and she had no reason to believe this time would be different from the other times except that she had run out of other places to go. She talked for 3 hours. She described the confiscated passports. Members were told the organization was holding their documents for safekeeping, and the documents were never returned. She described the punishment sessions, called catharsis, where members were required to confess failures in front of the group and were sometimes physically disciplined for infractions of the community's rules. She described the financial arrangements. Members were required to sign over significant portions of their assets to the organization upon joining, and those assets were not returnable upon leaving. She described the late-night assemblies where Jim Jones told the congregation that enemies were coming, that the government wanted to destroy them, that the only safety was inside the community and the only danger was outside it. She described, with the specificity of a woman who had been keeping mental notes for years because some part of her had always known she would need them, the names and dates and locations that turned her account from testimony into evidence. The agent who took her statement wrote a report. He wrote it carefully, in the language that federal documentation requires, precise, sourced, stripped of the emotional freight that Vera Washington's 3 hours of testimony had carried. He described People's Temple as an organization exhibiting characteristics consistent with financial fraud, unlawful detention, and systematic psychological manipulation. He recommended that the case be elevated to a full investigation. He filed the report through the appropriate channels. He marked it as requiring follow-up within 90 days. The follow-up never came. The agent, who spoke to journalists years after Jonestown, again under conditions of anonymity, said that he was never told explicitly why the case was not pursued. He said the report simply moved through the system and did not come back. He said this was not unusual. He said that in the 1970s, the federal government was in the middle of a period of significant internal reorganization following the revelations of COINTELPRO, the FBI's illegal surveillance and infiltration program targeting civil rights organizations. and that there was, at that time, an institutional reluctance to open investigations into organizations that had the surface characteristics of religious or civil rights groups, because the political cost of being seen as targeting such organizations was very high. He said that People's Temple, from the outside, looked like a civil rights organization with a religious component, that it had political allies at the highest levels of California government, that it fed poor families and ran drug rehabilitation programs and organized voter registration drives and had photographs of its leadership shaking hands with elected officials. He said that an organization that looked like that, from the outside, required a very high threshold of evidence before a federal investigation could be justified. He said the threshold, in his assessment, had been met by Vera Washington's testimony. He said his superiors disagreed. He said he does not know why they disagreed, and that he has been asking himself that question for 30 years. Vera Washington was not the only person who tried to tell someone about People's Temple in the years before Jonestown. She was the first of many. By 1976, at least a dozen former members had given formal statements to various law enforcement agencies describing conditions inside the organization. A network of relatives of current members had formed, calling themselves the Concerned Relatives, and had been sending letters and making phone calls to congressional offices, to the State Department, to the FBI, to the CIA, to anyone they could reach who might have authority to intervene. Grace Stone, whose son John Victor was being held in Jonestown and whose custody battle with People's Temple would become one of the most documented legal struggles of the period, had been working through lawyers and courts and diplomatic channels for 2 years trying to get her child back. Tim Reiterman at the San Francisco Examiner had been building an investigative file on the organization since 1975. Marshall Kilduff and Phil Tracy published a major investigative piece in New West magazine in August of 1977 that described, in detail and with named sources, the physical abuse, financial coercion, and psychological control that characterized life inside People's Temple. The piece ran. It was read. It was discussed. Nothing happened. This is the thing about Jonestown that the conventional account always struggles to accommodate. It was not a secret. Not by the end. By 1977, the broad outlines of what was happening inside People's Temple were available to anyone who looked for them. The New West article alone contained enough information to justify a serious federal investigation. But the information existed in a particular form. Dispersed across multiple agencies and jurisdictions, filed under different case numbers, told by people whose credibility could be questioned because they were former members with obvious grievances, attached to an organization that had powerful political allies and a public image that was difficult to reconcile with the private reality. The information existed, but it did not cohere. It did not add up to a single clear picture that demanded a single clear response. It was everywhere and nowhere, the way that certain kinds of evidence are present in the system, visible if you knew where to look, invisible as a whole because no one had assembled the whole. The man who came closest to assembling it was a Senate investigator named Gordon Lindsay, who spent the better part of 1977 building a file on People's Temple that drew on the FBI reports, the State Department cables, the testimonies of former members, and the New West investigation. Lindsay's file was the most comprehensive single document about the organization that had been assembled by anyone inside the government. He brought it to his supervisors in the fall of 1977 and recommended that it be used as the basis for a formal Senate inquiry. His supervisors reviewed it. They told him that the evidence, while concerning, was insufficient to justify a Senate investigation of a religious organization without additional corroboration, and that pursuing such an investigation without sufficient cause would expose the Senate to accusations of religious persecution. They told him to continue monitoring and to bring it back if the evidence strengthened. He continued monitoring. He brought it back twice more, in the spring and summer of 1978, each time with additional evidence. Each time he was told the threshold had not been met. In November of 1978 he was in Washington when the news came in from Guyana, and he went to his office and sat at his desk and did not move for a very long time. He spoke to journalists in the years after Jonestown. He said, "I had the file. I had everything. I knew what was in it. I believed it was sufficient. I was told it was not. I do not know, to this day, whether the people who told me that believed what they were saying or whether there was something else operating, political pressure, institutional caution, the simple human tendency to avoid a difficult thing when avoiding it is still possible. I cannot tell you that. I can tell you that I sat at my desk on November 19, 1978, with the file in front of me, and I read it again, and every page of it described something that happened before the people died, and none of it had been enough, and I could not explain why. What no official inquiry has ever fully answered, what the various congressional investigations and inspector general reviews and journalistic reconstructions of the period have circled without landing on, is the question of whether the failure was structural or individual. Whether Jonestown happened because the system was not designed to catch what Jones was doing, or whether it happened because specific people made specific decisions to look away. The answer, as best as the evidence allows, is both. The system was genuinely not designed to catch it. The jurisdictional divisions between local, state, and federal law enforcement, the constitutional protections around religious organizations, the political dynamics of the 1970s created a structure in which an organization like People's Temple could exist in plain sight and remain, technically and legally, beyond reach. And within that structure, specific people made specific decisions. To file rather than pursue, to monitor rather than act, to wait for a threshold that kept moving just beyond the evidence that was being assembled. 918 people died in Jonestown on November 18, 1978. The report that was written in 1973 is still in the archive. Vera Washington, who spent 3 hours telling a federal agent everything she knew, died in 2011. She spent the intervening years, by the accounts of her family, never fully making peace with the fact that she had done what she was supposed to do. She had gotten out, she had gone to the authorities, she had told them everything, and it had not been enough. Not because she had failed. Because the system that was supposed to receive what she gave it and act on it had, for reasons that remain officially unexplained, decided that it could wait. The report is in the archive. The case number is still active. The reasons it was set aside have never been given. And in the file, under Vera Washington's name, there is a note in the margin of the third page that the original agent wrote in 1973 and that no one who has read the file since has been able to interpret with certainty. It reads, "This will not end well." 3 words. Written 5 years before Jonestown. Filed. Set aside. Left in the archive with everything else that was seen and recorded and not acted on, waiting for someone to explain why seeing something clearly was never, in itself, enough. There is a question that every person who studies Jonestown cannot avoid. Not why the system failed. Systems fail, built by people with limitations and blind spots, failing in ways predictable in retrospect and invisible in the moment. The real question is what the system was actually designed to do. Because the honest answer is that the system was not designed to protect Vera Washington. It was not designed to protect the 918 people who died. It was designed to manage information, assign jurisdiction, document process, and protect itself from political criticism. And it did all of those things correctly. The report was filed. The case number assigned. The follow-up scheduled and not completed. The file reviewed and set aside. Every step executed as designed. And 918 people died. This is harder to hold than the alternative, that a corrupt official buried the report, that political pressure silenced the investigation, that a specific person explains the gap between the 1973 report and the 1978 massacre. If there is a villain, there is a lesson and a fix. If the villain is caught and punished, the lesson is learned and the system is fixed and the next Jonestown is prevented. But if the failure was structural, if the system worked exactly as designed and still produced 918 bodies, then the lesson is much more uncomfortable. Then the lesson is that the system needs to be redesigned from the foundation. Then the lesson is that the gap between what is visible and what is acted on is not a bug but a feature, built into institutions that are optimized for self-preservation rather than for the protection of the people they claim to serve. The agent who took Vera Washington's statement spent 30 years in federal law enforcement after Jonestown. He retired in 2003. In the years after his retirement, he gave occasional interviews to journalists working on Jonestown retrospectives, always anonymously, always with the same basic message. He said, "I did my job. I wrote the report. I filed it. I did what I was supposed to do. And I have spent 30 years understanding that doing your job and doing what is necessary are not always the same thing. That there is a gap between them. That the gap is where Jonestown happened. That the gap is where every preventable catastrophe happens, while the people who could close it are doing their jobs correctly and filing their reports and assigning their case numbers and waiting for a threshold that keeps moving just out of reach. He was asked, in his final interview before his death in 2009, whether he thought about Vera Washington. He said, "Every day. Not because I feel responsible. I did what I could with what I had. I think about her because she did everything right. She got out. She went to the authorities. She told the truth in detail and at cost to herself, and she trusted that the system she was speaking into would do something with what she gave it. And the system received what she gave it and processed it and filed it and did not act on it. And I don't have a better explanation for why than I did in 1973. And I think that is the truest thing I can tell you about what happened. Not that Jones was evil. Not that people were naive. But that a woman did everything she was supposed to do, and it was not enough, and nobody who was in a position to make it enough decided to do so. That's Jonestown. That's the whole thing, right there. The report is still in the archive. The case number is still active. Vera Washington's testimony is on record, all 3 hours of it, transcribed and filed and indexed and available to anyone who knows the reference number. The margin note, "This will not end well," is still there on the 3rd page, in the original agent's handwriting, written 5 years before anyone died. It was seen by everyone who reviewed the file. It was not acted on. It is still there now, in the archive, patient and precise and entirely correct, waiting for someone to explain why being right was never, by itself, enough to make anything different. Vera Washington's daughter, who was 7 years old the night her mother drove to Oakland with nothing but a single bag, gave one interview in 2008 on the 30th anniversary of Jonestown. She said her mother never talked about People's Temple inside the house. Not once in 35 years. But she kept a copy of the federal case number written on a piece of paper in her bedside drawer. Her daughter found it after she died. Just the number. Nothing else written. No explanation of what it meant or why she had kept it. Just the number, in her mother's handwriting, on a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. The daughter said she looked up the number. She found the file. She read the report her mother had given 30 years earlier. She read the margin note. And she said, "My mother was right about everything. She was right from the beginning. She told them everything." And I think she kept that number because she needed to remember that she had done the right thing, even when doing the right thing produced nothing. Even when the system swallowed what she gave it and returned nothing. She kept the number because it was proof that she had tried. That is what my mother left behind. Not justice. Proof that she tried.